Good evening, everyone. The Research Center and Postgraduate Department of English, Bharmada College, has been arranging invited lectures in various fields related to social science and humanities for a while. This is the first time that we have had an opportunity to think of something different that can merge science, technology, and social science. I know the audience are eager to listen to the lecture. Hence, I would like this opportunity to welcome the dignitaries to the session formally. I extend a warm welcome to our manager, Father Dr. Abraham Uliyapurathu, for creating an atmosphere to foster academic ambience in the college. Welcome, dear Father. Dr. Lizzie Kachipalli, principal of the college, is also a senior faculty member of the department. I'd like to welcome Lizzie ma'am to this session. Professor K.M. Johnson, our academic director, is a visionary and he always wishes to elevate the academic activities in the campus to a new frontier. Welcome, Professor Johnson, to this session. I welcome the faculty coordinator of the invited lecture series, Dr. Rose Sebastian, too. It's a great honor for the Department of English at Bharmada College to welcome Professor Jean-Baptiste Gouyon. We are truly proud that he accepted our invitation to deliver this lecture. I'd like to express special gratitude to Dr. Rose Sebastian, a faculty member who had the privilege of being mentored by Professor Gouyon during her Charles Wallace Fellowship. Professor Gouyon is the head of the Department of Science and Technology Studies at University College, London. Both Dr. Rose and I were pleasantly surprised to receive his email yesterday sharing his presentation made for this lecture. His dedication to tailoring the lecture for our audience in Kerala is truly commendable. We sincerely appreciate Professor Gouyon's effort and time. On behalf of the department, Bharmada College, and everyone gathered here, I warmly welcome Professor Jean-Baptiste Gouyon. I'd like to welcome the teachers and students from various departments who joined us today, my colleagues, all our students too. Hope the lecture will definitely open new horizons of knowledge. Thank you and have a great day.
Thank you, Tara. I request all the participants to keep their microphones on mute during the session and also to reserve your questions towards the end of the session. But you can type your questions into the chat box and it will be read out to the speaker by the end of the session. A short introduction to the speaker before we start. Professor Jean-Baptiste Gouyon teaches at the Department of Science and Communication Studies, and he is also the head of the department at University College London. Primarily trained as a biologist, he holds an MPhil in History of Science from University of Paris 7 and a PhD in Sociology from University of York, UK. His research focuses on the history of public displays of scientific and technological knowledge in visual media. As a member of the editorial board of the journal Public Understanding of Science, Gouyon is editor of the rubric Historical Moments in Public Understanding of Science. In 2019, he published a monograph on the history of wildlife television in Britain titled BBC Wildlife Documentaries in the Age of Attenborough. He writes more widely on the history of science television and science museum displays. Before working in academia, Gouyon was a science journalist in France for many years and contributed to popular French science magazines such as Science à Vie, Le Cahier des Sciences à Vie, and La Recherche. On to you, Professor Gouyon.
Thank you very much, Rose, and thank you very much for your introduction, and thanks a lot for inviting me. I'm very honored to be able to address you tonight. So what I would like to do is, so I will be introducing the field of science and technology studies in this talk. I will give you a brief overview of it, and then I have a case study to illustrate what I've discussed before. If you have questions, type while I speak. Please type them into the chat, and then but there will be time after I've spoken for a conversation discussion. So I guess the main question is why study science and technology and society. STS stands for Science and Technology Studies, but it is quite difficult. I mean, it doesn't really represent what it means. I think why STS, why studying science, technology, and society, and it's because we recognize the importance of science and technology as massive driving forces of change, social change, political change, and therefore science and technology need to be studied. STS, the study of science and technology in society, is an interdisciplinary field. So we study science from the perspective of the humanities, the social and historical sciences mostly. What we try and do is conceive of science as a cultural phenomenon, which both is shaped by the context in which it happens, but also tends to shape, in return, society and culture. As you will see in my talk, there are a few key concepts which I will elaborate upon as we go along. The first one, I think, the main one is social constructivism. So it's the idea that society constructs science. And as you will see, this idea has evolved from the time when it was first formulated to include the notion that society is also constructed by science. So it is becoming increasingly a bidirectional relationship. The second key concept in science and technology studies, I think, is methodological relativism. So it's the idea that we, as people who try to understand science in its social context, we do not pay attention to the truth of a claim to knowledge. What interests us is not so much whether things are true or false, but rather to understand why people think that they are true or why people think that they are false. So it is a methodological device if you want to try really understand what people do and how they position themselves in relation to science. The last concept, which I think is very interesting and important in science and technology studies, is the concept of boundary work, which is a manner of saying that people decide together as a society what counts as science and what doesn't, what is science and what is non-science, if you want. And all the work which goes into establishing this boundary is boundary work. It is a phrase which we owe to a sociologist of science, Thomas Guerin. And I've put on that slide a quote from Thomas Guerin, who says, "Essentialists do boundary work, and constructivists watch other people do boundary work." So it's the idea, and people who study STS are constructivists. Essentialists are people who think that there is an essence to science. I think a way of summarizing very broadly what STS is, it's as an ontology of science. It's really about trying to understand what is science, what's the nature of science. So the field of the social study of science and technologies has matured from the 70s onwards, and since the 90s, it is quite solidly established as an academic field. And on this slide, it's just to give you a sense of the fact that basically every decade since 1995, there has been a very thick textbook coming out, which groups studies and essays from leading scholars in the field. So it's just to serve as a reference. The very last one, the Elgar Encyclopedia of Science and Technology Studies, has just been published in October. So it's a field which is extremely lively. It is practiced by a lot of people around the world. And yeah, it is in constant evolution and progress. So in what follows, I will try to first give you a brief overview of the history of the development of the field. Then I will say a few things about more precisely the topic which matters the most to me, which is the presentation or the existence of science in public as seen from the perspective of sociology, of science and technology. And I will conclude with a case study, which is a brief, not so brief, but an overview of a paper I gave a few months ago, which is now published in a volume. So STS, the social study of science and technology, dips its roots in fact, the sociology of science of the 1940s and even before, in fact, but it's convenient to place the origin there. And then, as you can see, it evolved from there through the 60s, 70s into quite a well defined field of academic scholarly inquiry. On the slide, you can see book covers of books which I think are very important to engage with if you want to really get a sense of what STS is. Starting with Thomas Kuhn, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, and ending with Bruno Latour, Pandara's Hope, which was published in 1999. But I will say a bit more about all of this in the next slides. So let's start with Robert Merton. So Robert Merton was the first major sociologist of science of the post-war period. In fact, he started in 1942. And he came up with those Merton norms, which are very well known. His ideas was that science exists as a kind of autonomous entity aside from society. He saw it as its own social context. So for Merton, doing the sociology of science was mostly about understanding the social relationships within science. So it was a very internalist kind of approach to science. If society was involved in the picture, it was mostly to explain the mistakes which scientists made, or to explain why a scientific discovery hadn't had success in society. In Merton's view, the scientific field as a specific social context was ruled by very specific norms, which were in which young scientists were socialized as they were educated. So these norms, in fact, are very well known, and they are usually accepted and considered to be the actual norms of functioning of science. So these are, as you can see on the slide, communism. So it's the idea that scientists share their results between themselves. It's universalism, which means that science matters more than the scientist, and any scientist anywhere should reach the same kind of conclusion. So what matters is not the scientist, but the science itself. There is the norm of disinterestedness, which basically is quite self-explanatory. Scientists do not seek personal interest and reward. They work for the benefit of science as a whole. And then there is organized skepticism. So everything is open to scientific inquiry. There shouldn't be any barriers for scientists as to what kind of topic they explore, what kind of methods they can apply to the exploration of that those topics. And the idea is really that science is self-governed, if you want. To understand those norms, it's important to realize that they were formulated at the same time as the United States, where Merton was based, were engaging in a war against a totalitarian regime, which was the Nazi Germany. So defining science as a kind of non-totalitarian form of society, if you want, was important to distinguish it from what was being done by scientists in Nazi Germany. So there is a context to those norms, but as it happens, these norms, when you talk to a young university students in natural sciences, these are the norms that they think rule in the sciences. I won't go into details, but some sociologists of science have demonstrated that this is not the case. When you look precisely at what scientists do and how they behave with each other, these norms are counterbalanced by counter norms. So, for instance, there is the notion of secrecy, which intervenes when scientists start working for industrial research, for instance, and they work for they try to patent their discoveries, etc. So it goes against, for instance, the norm of communism. But I won't say anymore. Instead, let's move on to the next step of what can be seen as the development of the social study of science. And it's a very big one. It's the book which Thomas Kuhn, who was at the time in Harvard, he was professor in the history of science in Harvard, and he published that book, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, in 1962. And this is a book which caused a proper revolution because in that book, Kuhn questions the idea that science progresses in a linear fashion, and instead he suggested that science progresses through ruptures, revolutions. And what he calls revolutions are what he also calls paradigm shifts. So a paradigm is a worldview. It's a way of looking at the world. And an example he takes in his book is the image I just put on the slide can be seen in two ways. Either you see a duck, which is looking to the left, or you can see a rabbit, which is looking to the right. And whether you see a duck or a rabbit, you are in two different paradigms. And it is very difficult once you see a duck to keep seeing a rabbit, and once you see a rabbit, it's difficult to see a duck, and usually it's difficult to see both at the same time. And Kuhn used that analogy to explain that when scientists change their worldview, change the way they see the world, they can't go back, and they will start asking different questions, and they will start considering that specific questions are no longer valid because they were related to a previous worldview, a previous paradigm, and new questions become valid. And likewise, the methods to explore them are also changing depending on the paradigm. So what Kuhn introduces is the notion that what counts as science, as valid science, is relative. And it is tied to the historical context in which scientists find themselves. So the notion of science changes, and there can be, it is contingent, if you want. And that was a very important step in the understanding of the relationship between science, technology, and society. So in the wake of Kuhn's work, there is a group of sociologists, philosophers, historians who were all working in the same place in Edinburgh, in Scotland, and they came up with something they called the sociology of scientific knowledge. And so they built on Kuhn to elaborate a much more sociological and philosophical account of what is science and how it progresses. We owe methodological relativism to the Edinburgh School, that they are the first to say it's not because a claim to knowledge is true that it is accepted by society, but it is because it is accepted by society that it becomes true, it is considered true. And the very notion of what counts as knowledge is something which for the sociologist doesn't really matter. What matters is what people consider to be knowledge. So it is again that notion of relativism which comes up. It's the idea that things change depending on who you ask, which context you consider, not only historically but sociologically, depending on social classes, depending on countries, depending on economical conditions, etc. People will consider to be knowledge different things. And they will have a different relationship to science, and all this is coming from this book. If you read one book on the sociology of science, please read this one. It is a foundational text, and it's still very much actual. So they elaborated the Edinburgh School, and especially David Bloor, in that book from 1976, Knowledge and Social Imagery, they elaborated a program, and that program had 4 core tenets, which are on that slide. So the first one is that the sociologist of knowledge has to understand the causes of emergence of what they call states of knowledge or beliefs about knowledge. They need to understand what are the causes which enable people to believe in specific claims to knowledge. The sociologist of science, the person who studies science in relation to science and society, has to be impartial. So you have to be agnostic about what is true or false. And you need to provide the same kind of explanation to explain truth and falsity. And that is the third tenet. The same causes, the same types of causes would explain true and false beliefs. And it is also an approach which requires the sociologist to be reflexive, so that the same kind of patterns of explanation can be applied both to the science you are studying, if you want, and the sociology of science you are trying to elaborate. So, I mean, the real breakthrough of this Edinburgh School was to say science is not one thing. It can be many things, and we have to address all those different things, all these different versions of science, to try and understand how society relates to knowledge, its production, and scientists. So the sociology of scientific knowledge, as defined by the Edinburgh School, was extremely externalist. So it was mostly concerned with the context, the external context in which science exists. Some people thought that there was something missing from the picture, and they said we need to go back to the laboratory to try and understand how scientists work. And it's sprouted a series of studies which have been grouped under the label laboratory ethnographies, where sociologists went into labs. They spent weeks, months following scientists around, trying to understand how they work. And one of the things they found is that there is nothing separating the social world as it exists in the lab from the social world as it exists outside the laboratory. So they said that the social construction of scientific facts in the laboratory is not very different from the social construction of scientific facts outside the lab. And in fact, both outside and inside have to collaborate for scientific facts to be produced. And this became the foundation of an extremely important trend in theoretical thinking in the social studies of science and technology, something which has come to be known as actor network theory, abbreviated as ANT, and of which Bruno Latour, the French sociologist, is one of the main proponents, alongside John Law and Michel Callon, and a host of different people who've come since. The important contribution of actor network theory, or ANT, is to really link the laboratory to the context in which it find itself. And on the slide, you can see on the left-hand side there is a kind of concentric circles, which so the first one is this one is science. It's in the lab, and then there is a kind of intermediary domain, which is conferences, that kind of places where what is happening in the lab is exiting the lab and moving into the social realm. And as it goes along, it brings in money, it enables scientists to recruit collaborators and colleagues, it enables scientists to construct new instruments so that they can make new discoveries, etc. The object of science gets defined more clearly, the argument gets refined, etc. And then there is innovation, and then it's a constant circle, and all those wheels, if you want, turn together, and they contribute each other to the movement of one which is next to them. Actor network theory is perhaps the most complicated theoretical construction which came out of the construction of the social study of science and technology. It is something which we usually approach at the end of a bachelor degree on STS, and we bring it with a lot of precaution to postgraduate students who haven't been exposed to STS before, because it's quite difficult to put your head around it. But I needed to mention it here because it's really the end product of the 50 years of evolution of STS. Actor network theory is really trying to move beyond the idea that either science is dealing with making discoveries in the real world, or science is just a construction which will change according to political, historical context. And likewise, they don't really pay attention to the difference between what's going on in the lab and what's going on outside the lab. What is social, what is technical, what is natural, what is artificial. For them, it is all those things go together, and to understand one, you need to understand the other. And to an extent, they say that science and nature co-produce themselves, and science and society co-produce themselves. So a given society has the science it deserves, and a given science will exist in the society which enables it to exist. And you can't really divorce one from the other. But again, it's quite advanced, and it's going well beyond that notion of social constructivism. Aside from ANT, actor network theory, the strong program of the sociology of scientific knowledge has had quite a posterity. So in history of science, which is what I've been educated in, The book Leviathan and the Air Pump is 40 next year, and it's a major moment in the history of science. It is entirely based on this idea that the context in which science happens explains the science you get. But it has also brought a heavy reflection on science communication and the way in which social conversations about science shape not only the way in which people understand science, but also how science is done. And from there, I will move to discussing more precisely how the social study of science sees science communication. There are two views of science communication, if you want, which can be opposed, put one against the other, or contrasted. One is what is called the received view on the left-hand side of the slide, and the other is the STS view on the right-hand side. The received view is a very linear understanding of science communication. It's based on the idea that science is first developed and then it is communicated, and along the way it is modified, and the more people move science around, the worse it becomes, and at the end, no one can really understand what's going on. The STS view of science communication, on the contrary, doesn't see it as a linear process, but as one which goes in multiple directions, all at the same time. And it's not something which comes after science, but it is something which happens during science, as science is being produced. The received view has a very limited understanding of what the finality of science communication is. So the first value of science communication from that perspective is to educate people. The second one is to ensure that people have a good appreciation of science, a positive appreciation of science and scientists. And the third one is to enforce the idea that science is the only way to produce knowledge about the world. By contrast, the STS view of science communication views science communication as multidirectional, as I said, and as something which is intrinsic to the production of knowledge. Scientific knowledge, if you want, is made as it is communicated, and in fact, there can't be any production of knowledge without communication. And the value of science communication for science, in this view, is that it increases the accuracy of knowledge claims. And it sees communication as an intrinsic part of science and not something which happens after science has been developed. So if we take that idea of communication as being integral to science, we've got that paper by Massimiliano Bucchi, which is referenced on that slide from 1996, which I think is one of the most important paper you can read to understand science communication from an STS perspective. And it's a paper which really makes the case that we should move away from understanding science communication as something which happens after science has been developed, but understand it as something which happens simultaneously at different levels, which continuously exert influence on each other. In this paper, Massimiliano Bucchi discusses different stages of knowledge production, of science communication. I do not want to go into details here. We can talk about that in the questions if you want. The important thing to take away from this slide is that even though for the purpose of representation, it looks linear, it shouldn't be seen as a temporal sequence. Everything happens at the same time, and yeah, so it's this idea of simultaneously and reciprocal influence. So basically, what an STS definition of science communication from the would be is that science communication is not so much the scientists talking to the public, but it's all the conversations, all the exchanges of ideas which happen in public, in society, and between scientists, and how they all interact with each other. So it's all the exchanges which take place in a society about science. But it means that science communication cannot be seen as occurring in a vacuum. So it is, again, situated and contingent. So it happens in a place and at a specific time. And it is also, science communication has to, if you want to understand what's going on, has to, you have to take into account all the interactions between what is being communicated and other cultural contents, films, shop windows, theater plays, books. Everything has an impact on how science is communicated, and what kind of science is communicated. So, having very briefly and tried to describe how STS sees science communication, I will move to the case study. So that case study is an examination of a historical episode, which is the creation of a television and film unit at the London Zoo in 1956. And this unit operated until 1964 or 68, depending on what you admit as being operating. It is interesting as a case study because it fits within the history of the broadcasting of science in the UK, which is a kind of fraud territory where scientists have always wanted to control the way in which science is represented on television. And the reason for that is that they saw television as poorly equipped to represent science and scientists in television program. It's also an interesting case study because it relates to the history of natural history and the history of science as it is practiced in the field, as opposed to in the laboratory. One of the problems which field sciences and natural history have is that because they are practiced in the field, they are seen as difficult to control, as opposed to what you can do in the lab. So they are often seen as softer science, less reliable, and less solid. And so the creation of that television unit at the zoo relates to both histories. So just what it is we are talking about. In 1955, the London Zoo strikes a deal with a television production company, which is called Granada. The London Zoo is headed by Sir Solid Zuckerman, and Granada is headed by Sidney Bernstein, who was an entertainment entrepreneur. And the basic mission of the unit is to produce films and television programs about animals. And the head of that unit was supposed to be, and was for a few years, Desmond Morris, whom you may have heard of, an ethologist who specialized in trying to make connections between animal behavior and human behavior. So what I want to understand in this case study is, why did the zoo go into a deal with a television company to create the unit? So that's Solid Zuckerman, and that is Sidney Bernstein. And this is the press release they published in October 1955 for the unit to start in 1956. So this unit appears in a very specific context. the London Zoo had a very long-standing relationship with the BBC, first through television programs, and then through first through radio programs. I'm sorry, and then through television programs, mostly David Attenborough's Zoo Quest series. One of the justification for the relationship between the zoo and the media was that it would raise the number of visitors. But if you look in the archives of the zoo, in fact, you find out that television didn't bring new visitors or more visitors to the zoo. So that is part of the context to understand. There was no really clear advantage for the zoo to have that kind of association with the BBC. On top of that, in the early 1950s, the zoo collections were really depleted. A lot of animals had been killed during the war, and they hadn't been able to really replenish the collection. So that was the context from the zoo perspective. In the broader context, in the UK in the early 50s, there is a lot of questions about television as a medium. So it is recognized as the medium of the future, but politicians are thinking that there is some kind of problem with the fact that only one broadcaster exists, the BBC, and conservative governments which were elected in 1951 wanted to break up that monopoly. And so in 1954, they eventually got a law voted which opens television broadcasting to competition through the creation of the Independent Television Authority. So Zuckerman, the zoo person, the zoo, the Secretary General of the Zoological Society in London, takes advantage of that law, and from 1955, since the television is open to competition, he starts the conversation with Sidney Bernstein, who himself wants to create a company which will produce television programs for the Independent Television Authority. And Sidney Bernstein knows very well that animals are a winner in terms of television programs, so he wants to have access to the zoo collections to produce his programs. So on Bernstein's side, it's not very difficult to understand why he wants to create that unit. It's all in his interest. But in the case of the zoo, Zuckerman, it's not very obvious why he wants to go into that deal with Granada Television. So there are several possibilities. One is that Zuckerman wanted to place himself in the tradition of Julian Huxley, who had been a director of the zoo in the 1930s, and as this shows wanted to have a cinema installed in the zoo in 1936. So you could say that Zuckerman just tries to emulate that man who was quite famous still in the UK in 1955, and do the same thing as what he had done before World War II. Another option is to say that he needed that unit to redress the zoo's finance. By his own admission, the deal with the BBC, or the relationship with the BBC, had brought no new money to the zoo. So he was trying something else, basically, and trying to take control of it so that he was certain that any profit would go into the zoo's pocket. It can be about institutional politics, trying to free the zoo from what Zuckerman saw as the tutelage of the BBC. But I think a more productive way of explaining this is that Zuckerman was very keen to advocate captivity as a valid way of studying animals. And in particular, he wanted to pit study of captive animals against the study of wild animals in the field, because he thought that the study of wild animals in the field wasn't reliable from a scientific perspective. And as it happens, the BBC was producing films, wildlife films, which were all celebrating the study of animals in the field. So that's the short clip you see on the slide is one of those where it shows a cameraman setting up his tripod to and to try and film animals so that they will not see him. And so that we are certain that these are wild animals, which is a guarantee that they will be, the behavior that will be filmed is natural. Plus, at the BBC, they saw zoo programs as best for holidays and children, so not serious. So from the perspective of Zuckerman, the way in which the BBC was approaching filming captive animals was problematic, because it was downgrading the scientific standing of the zoo. As I said, Zuckerman was a zoologist, and he was very keen to promote the zoo as a scientific tool for understanding the behavior of animals. And to him, the fieldwork, the outside was not a controlled enough environment to reach conclusion about animal existence, which were valid, if you want. On the contrary, captivity was a way of magnifying behavioral traits, because you increase the density of animal population, and you didn't have to run around after them to find them in the field. They were in their cage, so it was very practical to the scientist. Zuckerman produced one film which is called Monkey into Man, and it's a film which looks at the evolution from monkeys to man, to demonstrate that monkeys are intelligent, but that captivity is the way to is what brings that intelligence forth, which a scientist wouldn't be able to recognize if they were just observing monkeys or animals in the wild. So I've just got a very short extract of Monkey into Man to show you.
Liveliest and most sociable of the anthropoids are the chimpanzees. But in spite of their varied behavior, in their wild state, they make little effort to use their intelligence. They take their surroundings as they find them. Their only attempt at constructing anything is the nest which they build at night. The apes, like the monkeys, take a tremendous interest in the fur of other animals. This instinct shows itself in captivity in a passion for investigating articles of clothing. Shoes, particularly, attract some apes. Taking off a man's shoe, the chimpanzee shows a command of hand and eye far beyond the ability of a young human child. But it hasn't the constructive intelligence to put it on again.
So you can see that in this film, Zuckerman argues that not only is captivity useful to the scientists to understand animal behavior, but it is also something which is good for the animals, because it stimulates them to use their intelligence in a way which they wouldn't in the wild. And as an aside, you could also say that to Zuckerman, the film, because it is edited, so you can remove everything which is useless to you, is also a way of densifying observation of animal behavior. So this scientific controversy looks like something which is potentially the explanation for why Zuckerman wanted the film unit at the zoo. And indeed, he charged the Desmond Morris with producing films about not only animal behavior, but also zoological research. And his idea was that the films produced at the unit would enable zoologists, amateurs, and professionals to observe the patterns of behavior which are revealed by captivity. It was also part of that effort from scientists to control the broadcasting of science. The head of the unit was to be a university-trained zoologist, so Desmond Morris, who was finishing his PhD with Nico Tinbergen in Oxford. And it was really meant to link between the zoo and the public, drawing on the appeal of animal. And Zuckerman had great ambitions for that unit. He wanted it to become the foremost unit of its kind anywhere for the televising and filming of animal life. So he really hoped that unit would enable him to raise the profile of his understanding of how animals should be studied, animal behavior should be studied, and raise that public profile. Of animal behavior study. So time is running, so it's time to conclude. So basically, I mean, obviously my chapter is much more detailed, but what I hope I suggested to you is that creating the unit for the zoo, the interest was to try and control television, which was seen as a new medium at the time. In 1955, it was seen as very powerful, as a way of shaping public opinions, how people saw science in general. And it was also meant to clarify the separation, so the boundary between a learned society, the Zoological Society of London, and the BBC, which was or is still a media organization. So it is an instance of boundary work, which is based on a very specific understanding of what science is and how it should be practiced. So Zuckerman, from that perspective, was an essentialist, if you want. And his creation of the unit was part of his boundary work. As I said, Zuckerman saw the creation of the unit as a means of promoting his very own conception of how animals should be studied, and to promote the value of captive study instead of studying animals in the field, in the wild. And as such, the unit itself is one more episode in the ongoing struggle between natural history, field sciences, and zoology as an academics discipline to appear as cognitively authoritative in the public sphere. And the last part of the last conclusive point is to say that it is also from a more broadly sociological perspective. It's also part of that tense relationship of which we still see examples today between the media and the scientific establishment, which is very keen to control who can participate in the sciences and how what form that participation can take. So to conclude this talk, the study of science and technology and medicine from the perspective of humanities, social and historical sciences, which we group under the acronym STS, draws the attention to the fact that there is much more to producing knowledge, there is much more to science than the work scientists do in the laboratory. With the case study, we saw that, for instance, the way in which science is broadcast on television can have has a role to play in how knowledge is produced and in how I mean, in the methods and means which are recognized or accepted as the best ones to actually produce knowledge of the world. And that case study also shows that understanding science in public is in fact understanding the relationship between science and society, and to acknowledge that society shapes science as much as science is trying to shape society. And before we move on to questions, just a plug for my department. So at University College London, we offer 3 masters, 3 MSc programs, one in history and philosophy of science, one in science, technology and society, and one in science communication. And all of them lead either to doing a PhD with us or somewhere else, or all our graduates find a job in a lot of different domains, be it finance, consulting, accounting, non-governmental organizations, museums, media, government. The list is endless. And if you want to find out more, I've put a link here, which hopefully you will be able to access if Dr. Sebastian circulates the slides. So I am done with this presentation, and I'm happy to take any questions you may have.